So good evening, everyone. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of Architecture at California College of the Arts. Thank you for joining us tonight for this panel discussion and dinner theater, Reclaiming Land from Dispossession to Reciprocity, organized by Assistant Professors Jeanette Kim and James Graham. I'm thrilled to have such a distinguished lineup of speakers, Emmanuel Admasu, Kelly Easterling, David Forten, and Brittany Udding, with us tonight for this third event in the Fall 2022 Architecture Lecture Series, Climate Justice, through which we're reflecting upon the entangled relationships between the climate crisis and racial justice. Please note that if you're joining us tonight on Zoom, you can enable closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window with a live transcript button. As we return this year to fully in-person teaching, learning, and making on campus for the first time in 2 years, we believe it's important to acknowledge the history of the land upon which we're working and honor those who came before us. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacy. California College of the Arts campus is located in Yelamu, also known as San Francisco, on the unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay our respect to local elders, including those on the lands in which you're joining us virtually today. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd like to thank the organizers of our lecture series, Irene Sang, Adam Marcus, and Niraj Bhatia, and tell you about the next event in our series. Next Thursday, October 13th at 6 p.m., Mei-Ling Loco, an architectural scientist, designer, and assistant professor at Yale University School of Architecture, whose work focuses on the upcycling of agri-waste and biopolymer materials, will lecture in person here on our San Francisco campus. You can register for this event by visiting our website at scaffold.architecture.cca. On Scaffold, you can also see the full lecture series schedule, watch videos of past events, and read stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni. And now I'd like to hand things over to Jeanette Kim, Assistant Professor and Co-Director of CCA's Works Agency, who will introduce tonight's event.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to welcome you to this event, to Reclaiming Land. Tonight's panel is part of a series of events on property. And property has been a particular focus for many of us here at CCA, because this kind of curious legal device so closely aligns techniques for generating wealth and power with the spatial manifestations of social life and cultural continuity. 2 years ago, I organized a conference focused on the decommodification of property with my urban works colleagues Antje Steinmüller and Niraj Bhatia. And following up on that, tonight's event, which James Graham and I organized with very welcome input from Niraj Bhatia, is called From Dispossession to Reciprocity. As a kind of dispossession, property laws have long instituted racial visions of value. This is a point that Brenna Banjar makes really vividly in her book called The Colonial Lives of Property. Property law has been protected, or property law has protected, for example, improvement claims over Indigenous ancestral rights, creditors over laborers, and nuclear families over nuclear members, all to prioritize those with the ability to commodify land. But other characterizations and relationships to land have also endured. And in the context of climate justice, which is the theme of this fall's lecture series, the goal of our gathering tonight is to ask how narratives of property might be recast through different kinds of reciprocity with land. How can architects especially envision the entanglements, responsibilities, and risks brought forward by climate change in a way that can reflect more manifold values and work towards justice and liberation for BIPOC people? It's a real treat that we get to consider these questions with tonight's speakers, who James will introduce.
Yeah, so echoing Jeanette, what a pleasure to be gathered here. I have no idea where to look. This is very
Your camera.
both physically and I look at the camera. To be exploring these questions. I'm just going to be giving some brief introductions before each speaker to keep things moving along. So first up, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Emmanuel Admasou, who is the founding principal of ADWO and an assistant professor at Columbia University GSAC, where he teaches design studios and theory seminars in urban design and architecture, including a really fantastic studio this semester on Atlanta after property. He's written on these topics in a lot of venues you might have seen, efflux architecture, and there's a great essay in a mass context called Compounds that Jeanette and I were reading. We were thinking about this panel. His teaching, his research, and his design practices examine the international constellation of Afro-diasporic spaces. And Admasou completed his Bachelor of Architecture at Southern Polytechnic State University, followed by a Master of Advanced Architectural Design and a Master of Advanced Architectural Research at Columbia. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Emmanuel Admasou.
Hello, everyone. It's a very intimidating list of presenters and moderators. So I'm just glad my last name starts with an A and I get to go first. Thank you guys so much for having me. I look forward to the discussion. So I'm just going to present a series of fragments, mostly teasers that hopefully we will discuss at the end. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I'll just start here. I mean, lately I've been thinking a lot about noticing. And in a recent episode of the podcast, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, the renowned abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore spoke about noticing. And more specifically, she used a quote from Kwame Ture, aka Stokely Carmichael, where he states that Marx and Engels didn't invent communism, they just noticed it. They saw what people were doing and thought about it a lot. And Ture basically saying noticed caught Gilmore's attention. And Gilmore articulates how this act of noticing and thinking about what people are doing more than what they're saying is critical for contemporary abolitionists. Understanding abolition as a quotidian practice, she asks, how can we have a framework that enables this noticing to happen? And how can we accumulate what we notice into some type of understanding of what we can do next? A lot of what I've been doing through my teaching and my practice at ADWO in collaboration with Jen Wood is really developing frameworks that enable us to notice spatial practices that contain tactics for liberation. Understanding how people are organizing against the slow violence of capital and coloniality and rapidly transforming cities like Addis Ababa and Dar es Salaam, while finding refuge in opacity, working against the forced transparency of the ethnographic gaze. But also there's an interest in dwelling in the limits of translation and the power of abstraction. Noticing the everyday space of Black life in Atlanta and the various forms of communality and togethering that exist in spaces that have been devalued by the racialized regime of property. But also thinking about the construction sites in Mercato and Addis Ababa and what they might suggest about temporal forms of occupation that resist the development paradigm. But also zooming out again and considering our current predicament as a crisis generated by the overrepresentation of a singular worldview, what Sylvia Wynter calls the overrepresentation of man, capital M. By that, she means bourgeois European male worldview of discovery and conquest. So what are other ways of seeing and valuing the world that fall outside of this hegemonic epistemology? And this is really the question that fuels most of the thinking in our work. Noticing has also been, as was mentioned in the intro, a major part of my ongoing pedagogical experiments. And for the past few years, I've been teaching a series of studios called After Property across multiple institutions. And this iterative experiment was initiated through a 7-week studio taught over Zoom. And these studios are really framed around a central question. How can we disentangle architecture and urban design from property? The student projects begin by noticing temporal slippages and spatial practices that carve out moments of liberation from the limits of property. So in other words, they're experimenting with ways of seeing beyond the privatized enclosure, building a world that is not tethered to power and capital. Within our practice, the project Two Markets really tries to accept the fact that there's nothing definitive or closed about these two marketplaces we've been studying, which are Kariako and Mercato. Wole Soyinka writes about marketplaces as, quote, humanity uniting structures. Basically spatial typologies, especially on the African continent and elsewhere in the global South, that maintain difference as a virtue. More recently, we've been studying various ways of making and dissolving territory in Addis Ababa. The Amharic word Gibbi connotes a territory surrounded by a wall or a fence, basically a zone of respite and relative stability that has been carved out of an errant and restless city. The boundary of the Gibbi has literally and metaphorically expanded over the past 50 years. And of course, as you can imagine, it is not a line on a map, but a zone of contestation, which is pushed and pulled by shifts in politics, culture, and economy. Lately, we've been also thinking about it as a stage for the reenchantment of everyday spaces and rituals in Addis Ababa, bounded by yet temporally detached from the regime of property. Our recent design projects have also been attempts to stack the Gibbis of Addis Ababa. The ground and the wall, the most definitive aspects of the Gibbi, are never fixed. The ground is multiplying vertically to house an exponentially growing population, while the plots are shrinking to make way for the expansion of roadways. But I think it's also important to understand that the Gibbi is not a retreat from the world, but a site where people have managed to cultivate community. In one of the final chapters for his book, Poetics of Relation, Edward Glissant writes, to de-individuate relation is to relate to the theory of the lived experience of every form of humanity in its singularity. This means returning to the opacities. Our work for the exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, was an attempt to grapple with the conditions that converted a geological ridge into a sociogenic rift, especially post-1492. In other words, our ongoing project, Immeasurability, is an attempt to use the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and its opacities as an ontological frame to think about Afro-diasporic migration, both past and present. For those of you who don't know, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is the longest mountain range on the planet, situated on the ocean floor between Africa and the Americas. It is a site that prefigures a global Black aesthetic, but also a site for the actual formation of Blackness. But of course, it's also a site for an incalculable loss of Black life during the Middle Passage. And Glissant notes, the Atlantic is a mausoleum that challenges us to find ourselves in relation with the other. One of the materials found on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a magnetic black sand called magnetite. This finding really focused our experiments. And we decided to use magnetite to model Black quotidian spaces in Atlanta. And these are spaces that are devalued or rendered illegible by the regime of property. Because, as we all know, racial capitalism relies on the entanglement of race and space. In other words, the value of space is directly linked to the racialized value of its occupants. This means working class Black neighborhoods in Atlanta are situated at the very bottom of this hierarchy. So we started our experiments in representation by doing a series of image and material studies that conceptualize Black spatial practices between flow and form. And we were interested in the slow material transformations of sand to glass. And while we were making these models and drawings, we were also thinking about ongoing practices of refusal that transform spaces of subjugation like the highway in Atlanta into space of Black joy. We worked through a series of these image studies that considered the overlaps between the forest and these everyday spaces. And anyone who's ever been to Atlanta knows the importance of the forest, especially as it relates to more recent activism against plans to clear the forest for film studios and police training facilities. The installation we made is made up of 2 discs, and they're both 6 feet in diameter, a horizontal disc that is a dynamic model of everyday space in Atlanta, while the vertical disc is a tapestry depicting the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. There were also the 2 large collages on the wall of the gallery that present a landscape that is both mythical and ordinary. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Such a rich presentation. Next up, it is always an honor to introduce someone who is a great influence, I think, on me and Jeanette both. Keller Easterling is a designer, a writer, and is the Enid Storm Dwyer Professor of Architecture at Yale, where she teaches design and chairs the really important Master of Environmental Design program. Few people write as insightfully about design and politics as Keller Easterling, and her deep research on spaces of globalization, how we sort of see through the surfaces of architecture, how we see the effects of infrastructure, have, I think, had tremendously far-reaching effects for how we all really study this stuff. Her books include the recent Medium design from last year, Exeter Statecraft from 2014, Subtraction also from 2014, Enduring Innocence from 2005, and Organization Space of Landscape, Highways and Houses in America, which blew my young mind. So please join me in welcoming Keller. Well, I have to unmute you. I'm sorry.
Now, can you hear me? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just thank you for that, and I'll just share my screen. Is that working? Yeah.
Great.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's nice to be in this company. And what's so great about meeting with the colleagues assembled here is that while there are legal and political ways of decommodifying property, I know you all are leading with the spatial apparatus of community, with exchanges in physical, lumpy, temporal space, rather than other kinds of abstractions like the financial abstractions of capital that have been the cause of so much automatic harm. And those who have been heir to so much of that harm and who have crafted the most potent counter logics and antidotes are also speaking a spatial language on an urban stage. Communities rely on presence and proximity and entanglement as are the means to some relief from or reparations for dispossession and gentrification and environmental violence. And as Emmanuel eloquently said already, these are the very networks of mutualism and care and maintenance and kinship that are at the heart of Indigenous, abolitionist, Black feminist thinking, the buen vivir of the pluriverse, the commons that was the prevailing approach to land before the last 500 years of colonizing, globalizing, and capitalizing. And it is some of the material eclipsed by modern Enlightenment whiteness. So to consider these alternatives to property is to do part of that work that's frequently still myopically neglected, the work of displacing whiteness from its mistakenly presumed position of central neutrality to its real position as an extreme and usually bloody outlier. And this space does more than replace capital with a superior system, like a one-for-one move that would reproduce yet again the same singular evils, singular solutions that accompany that white habit of mind. So rather than a singular unifying force, there can be anarchism and mutualism, reciprocity that rely on difference essential to interplay and interdependence, even rely on the interplay of multiple problems. How do you not just replace capital, but overwhelm capital with multiple modes of exchange? And this is another kind of community infrastructure that's worthy of just as much funding as the infrastructures of concrete and conduit. And maybe I could show you a couple of examples of some community infrastructure protocols that we've worked on, not master plans, but interplays unfolding in time, a changing set of interdependencies that uses alternative landholding organs. And I show these to you, like nothing works, no one thing works. Design is not about one thing, but about the way things go together. A Yale studio from a few years ago went to the fat white middle of the US to look at a tangle of problems stretching from tribal lands in Oklahoma to Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, of course. And the project offered a chance to work on whiteness, but it also offered the possibility of a political trick. Since the Depression, those red states have received excessive subsidies, even as they vote against big government. So neutralizing critiques of the Green New Deal by saying that the old New Deal is still in place, we tried to see just how much of the Green New Deal could be accomplished by diverting funds from the old New Deal, often using alternative landholding organs. So in Minneapolis, that has a bloated police budget, and just outside of town, family farms routinely receive subsidies of millions of dollars a year. This interplay siphoned money from both police and farming monocultures to fund an unusual community land trust that had both rural and urban holdings. And then using techniques for both defunding policing and decommodifying properties, this community land trust was taking a ledger of discontinuous property and generating interdependent spatial relationships between them. So could pairing needs at both ends of the urban and rural spectrum potentially set off a kind of chain reaction? Capital is so stupid. It doesn't get organizations that are alive but community economies, I'm using J.K. Gibson Graham's term here, community economies are live organizations that can redouble values, make something from the most ephemeral exchanges, like one seed that when planted produces 10. It's not magic. It just doesn't make any sense to a world made of math. And the misinvestments of capital have often been in the business of obstructing this incalculable productivity in ways that usually fail. And the failures that have fallen off the ledger are material for design, material even for potentially addressing the incalculable debt of reparations. We're in Oklahoma, a little further south, where the violence of the past, this is End of the Trail of Tears, the Dust Bowl, and it's a disaster. That violence meets continued harm from systemic discrimination and racism in the agricultural sector. So precision mapping that collates these spectacular failures of government programs presents some opportunities for change, in part because the exhausted land loses its previous viability and is ripe for conversion to another purpose, like regenerative agriculture, or considering retiring farmers, spent land. Another interplay gathers properties into trusts, like wind trusts that have more, that are more sustaining for bankrupt farmers. And the interplay also looks at the effect of changing the terms of state trust lands, the famous checkerboard of state trust lands, enforcing by enforcing the power of tribal jurisdictions to redress the theft of land and wealth and sovereignty from Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So in these cases, what would it be? A pilot project joining forces with other pilot projects that might take advantage of just how much failure has been multiplied to multiply itself, or influence legislation that further multiplies interplay. And the second project I'll show, I wanted to show because I want to see if it's possible also to use the written word to reach a broader audience. Culture is not really telling the story of community economies. I want to tell a story about a place in rural Southwest Georgia that became a global stage for rehearsing some of the world's most provocative experiments with community and land tenure in the wake of civil rights struggles. There was an interracial intentional community, a Nation of Islam farm, a community land trust, the first community land trust, and a wave of cooperative experiments moving through the South in the late 1960s and 70s found fertile ground around Albany, Georgia, a town that W.E.B. Du Bois called the heart of the Black Belt. But also reflecting solidarity between civil rights, Pan-African, non-aligned, and tricontinental movements. Prominent international activists also linked this area in the US South to decolonizing efforts in the global South just prior to a neoliberal turn. And so in this network of spaces, the victims of white supremacy, again, best able to come up with the counter logics, modeled approaches to survival that are now broadly relevant to both social and climate justice work. And it's a story I want to tell because it conjures not one thing here, but a spectrum of spatial tools and surprising histories that might contribute to, might ground, it might energize a fresh wave of activism, like the activism of people in this room, that's looking to collective forms of urban and rural landholding. The tools used to deliver reparations and counter dispossession are now also used to address informal settlements and environmental disasters around the world that are the results of neoliberal forms of inequality and abuse that may be, even more lethal and untraceable than those of the colonizing empires. So it's a chance, the story offers a chance to look at the failures of white activism, but also asking, how can the story be inscribed in both spaces and biographies unfolding over time? How do the dispositions of community and activist leadership develop what James C. Scott calls meatus, or know-how? How can it be as graphic and compelling as other popular stories? And how might this wave of activism be tougher and more defiant by not being singular and universal, but by being planetary, patchy, partial, inconsistent, as it deals with multiple ecologies, multiple dangers, and political superbugs? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, what a pleasure it is to welcome Dr. David Fortin, a registered architect in Ontario, a citizen of the Métis Nation, and a professor at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. David has taught architectural history, theory, and design in the UK, US, and Canada. He's published on topics related to Indigenous design, Métis architecture, speculative architectural thinking, including the relationships between science fiction and design. He was previously the director of the MacEwan School of Architecture and the inaugural associate director of the Mamwizing Indigenous Research Institute at Laurentian University. And he's also coming up a part of a really exciting team called Architects Against Housing Alienation that's going to be doing the Canadian pavilions at the next Venice Biennale. So please join me in welcoming David Fortin. And I have to unmute you again, sorry. Oh my goodness. There you are, sorry.
Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay, and are you seeing my my screen?
Yes.
Still? Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I'm going to jump right into it because we're on tight time frame. I'll just frame this. Say this is one of my studios from 2017. My first, the first graduate Indigenous design studio that I taught, and really just emphasize that what I'm really interested is the idea of relational thinking in design. This is a lodge at Batchewana First Nation. Also want to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada. This is a quote, I'm not going to read it all, but from the former dean of Yale's forestry. You may have seen this online at some point, where he talks about being wrong about what the causes of climate change are, that really the top environmental problems, he said, were selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And I've argued that we could cross out scientists and put architects clearly in there, and we'd be in the same boat. Unfortunately, we've had lots of warning over the years. In 1977, Douglas Cardinal, a Blackfoot architect and Anishinaabe elder, wrote that we have something in our way of life, in our roots, in our heritage, that is knowledge that surpasses that of the majority society. They have lost their affinity with the environment, while we still feel the oneness of all living beings, the oneness of all life. We have a tremendous amount of knowledge to offer mankind. We must teach in the industrial societies the meaning of life. And one of a central critique that many Indigenous architects and peoples have about when we talk about design is we say so focused on the human only, and it's, I believe, at the root of a lot of our problems. Leroy Littlebear, the Blackfoot philosopher and writer, summarizes it fairly simply to say that the earth cannot be separated from the actual being of Indians. And Jameson, writing, citing William James, by contrast, talks about the ideology of individualization in the Western world, where one's personal identity is closely linked to the unity and centeredness of the subject or the psyche, to my private property. my ownership of my own memories. And as soon as I lose title to them, I lapse into schizophrenic dissolution. Again, very different opinion about our kind of existentiality or our positionality in the world. So as James just mentioned, I'm not going to talk about this much, but this idea of private property, I'm collaborating with 5 others as a curatorial collective called the Architects Against Housing Alienation, because we really believe that commodity, by making a home a commodity, has been unbalanced and caused a housing crisis in our country, where over 13% of our gross domestic product is in real estate. A lot of it is speculative. And as an example, in downtown Toronto, there are over, I don't know the exact number, something like 20 or 30,000 vacant condos sitting there as investments in the middle of a housing crisis with homelessness going crazy. So something's wrong, and we are on a mission to make some noise about it this year. About property, when we were researching, myself and Adrian Blackwell, I approached an elder who's close to me when I was up in Sudbury, Winnie Pittawanakut, and I was asking her what she thought about the idea of property. And her answer was pretty expected in many ways, but still made me reflect a lot. And she said, how can somebody own the land? Do they think they own the trees too? What about the birds, the animals, the insects? I've never really understood how someone can think they own any of it. And a student that I was working with at the time drew this little diagram to show the perversity of this. So we talk about it in some of our work as being, it's a fantasy that we have an idea that we own anything. What gives us any right over that tree to claim it as ours or anyone else's? So that led to the issue of scapegoat, which was talking about Canada delineating the nation state, where we brought together Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars to talk about property and the way it sort of provides the infrastructure for the way we think of design. In many ways, as a condition we don't even question. The way that Canada is spelt with the backslashes is borrowed from my colleague, Nisga'a architect Patrick Stewart. Lugugu is his traditional name. When he writes about that, because he talks about the violence of the land, and those lines we thought were so representative of the idea of property, that Canada itself is only formed by breaking up the land in this sort of violent way. And in Canada, as it was in the United States, this is something that I had found in some of my digging and research. This was from the Department of Interior in 1875. They were writing about
Even you've muted somehow. Let's see what we can do about this.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, maybe you could go back a slide, and we lost you just as you started describing that.
Okay, let me just see here what's going on here. In this one? I'll jump in here. In Canada, much like in the United States, I think the idea that your citizenship is dependent on your ability to own something. So here, this is a report that was sent to Ottawa from the Department of the Interior in 1875 that said, time must be given to the Indian to understand the motives and acquire the habits of the white man who labors to accumulate wealth in order that he may have the means to support his family, basically. And when these motives come to be understood and acted upon by the Indian, the evidence of which is the possession of considerable property acquired by his own industry, it shows that he's worthy, basically, of the rights of full citizenship. This was written into our laws, the idea of being a citizen of Canada. So you can imagine, as an Indigenous person, someone steals your land and then tells you got to work for it to acquire more of it to prove that you should be there. Quite perverse. And this is a map that sort of shows in Canada the 3 different ways to think about property in one map. I won't go into any details other than say that we have the Dominion grid, which is equivalent to, I can't remember what you guys call it down there, the Jeffersonian grid. But the idea of this Cartesian way of dividing up land, totally unrelated to landscape. And then the bottom right-hand corner is the reserve for the First Nations, which has no land delineation at all. And in between them are the Métis, which is the nation I come from, which we come from in Indigenous and European heritages. And our river lot system that was used sort of gave equitable relationships to the water for transport and irrigation, and the road system. So despite being delineated like the Europeans, it still promoted the idea of equity. So just down to a design, just to share a bit of this, in 2019, I partnered with Wanda Della Costa and Eladia Smoke, and we brought our elder Winnie Pitawanakwit on our team, and were asked to offer a vision for the Indigenous people space in Ottawa. And the quick version of this, the building at the top of the screen is the Canadian center block of our Parliament buildings, and the orange buildings in 2000, I want to say 17. These are heritage buildings that were gifted to the Indigenous peoples of Canada so that they can have a political presence on Capitol Hill. The complication is that the upper orange building is the former US Embassy designed by Cass Gilbert, and it's a heritage building in Canada. So although the gesture of offering a new nation-to-nation relationship with our Indigenous peoples in Canada was a good one, the building itself became problematic for us because we were told you're not actually allowed to touch the building. And the other complication is that the rest of the block was part of a design competition which recently concluded. So when we came on the project, we were told that we couldn't touch the Cass Gilbert building, and because of the property lines, which we had to respect, and the new buildings to come, we basically had this 7-story space in the middle of the block that we could work with. And one of my colleagues, either Wanda or Ladia, looked at that and said, "Oh, great, we get to indigenize the loading dock." You know, so this will be one day the most important Indigenous building in Canada in many ways because of its positionality with our government, and that's what we were left with. So Winnie told us to design something that would make our grandmothers proud first and focus on that, and we threw out all the property lines and all the rules, and we offered them something that we felt needed to make a statement, even though we know this would never get built. We believed that we needed that land beside that building for ceremony, for powwows, for teepee raisings, to celebrate our Indigenous cultures. So we'll never get that, at least not in this configuration. But this is the case where we wanted to make a statement about property directly. Similarly, in 2018, at the Venice Biennale, group of Indigenous architects, when we decided how we would represent architecture to the global world from an Indigenous perspective, the first move we decided was that to us, buildings are about storytelling, and they're about landscapes, and they're about voices, and they're about the relations between all of those things. So we said no orthographic drawings, no mini models that make us feel like we're in control of the world at a smaller scale, but to really loud voices and music. And the moving image tell the story of the way we think of buildings. And lastly, just to say that in the way I teach studios, this is very much about getting students onto the land, hearing the stories of the land. This is a petroglyph site in Northern Ontario. Embracing Indigenous knowledge through making. So birch bark canoes. I was very lucky to be part of the MacEwan School of Architecture at Laurentian, where right from the get-go, indigeneity was part of our curriculum. So building wigwams with our elders and understanding both from a sustainability perspective and also relationality to materials and animals. And that's carried through to other studios. And this is one we built in 2019. And I'll just share this as an example of what happens when you teach from this perspective. And really at the core of a lot of this is language. And really this is an inspirational image by a non-Indigenous student who was studying the language as part of her semester. And there's so many teachings in the language of the place. And there's so much knowledge that our Indigenous people hold that help us see the world without those boundaries and those property lines. And this is really the core to a path forward. So I just end with Douglas Cardinal, who's a great mentor of mine. He writes that I believe the teachings of the elders are not about the past, they're about the future. And our intention is very powerful. And we were just with him actually a few days ago at the Museum of History in Ottawa, just to say that we're working on an embassy design studio. I'm calling my studios lodges now. But we're also questioning this idea of design in the context of embassies. You know, what is the nation state of Canada? What about all the nations within Canada? And how do you express Canada in a post-reconciliation world internationally? So we're engaging in some pretty difficult conversations, and Douglas has offered his thoughts on that. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, David. That was fantastic. So last but very much not least, and by the way, everybody's on the East Coast, so we're keeping them up late to suit our schedule. So last but not least, we're happy to welcome Brittany Utting, an assistant professor of architecture at Rice University and a co-founder of the Research and Design Collaborative Home Office, which is just a great name for a firm. Her work examines the relationship between architecture, collective life, and environmental care. Brittany received her Master of Architecture from Yale, a BS in Architecture from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and was previously an Overdick Fellow at the University of Michigan, which our faculty of esteemed lineage. Brittany is a registered architect in New York and previously practiced at Thomas Pfeiffer as and she's currently editing the volume Architectures of Care from the Intimate to the Common, which is coming out next year on Routledge, and which I am sure will be entering the theory syllabus next year. So join me in welcoming Brittany.
Hey, thank you so much for the kind invitation and to join this very intimidating panel. I'm very annoyed I have to go last. But thank you so much. I'm super excited to share the work. So I'm going to share my panel. Everyone can see? Oh,
No, not yet.
We can.
Sorry, share. Good? Yes, okay, great. So this evening, I'll be speaking about a project by Home Office, a practice that I lead alongside Daniel Jacobs. Recently, our work has been examining the forest as a critical site of political struggle and environmental reform. And so tonight, I'll be sharing a project called Field Station that reimagines the spatial practices and possible architectures of forest governance, environmental sensing, and climate advocacy. So due to the complex relationship between resource extraction and property, forest practices have evolved into an intricate set of social, financial, and legal structures. From the Charter of the Forest of 1217 that granted commoners access to the forests of medieval England, to contemporary activist movements such as Ende Gelände, a civil disobedience group occupying the Hambach Forest in Germany's Rhineland, protecting it from the nearby mining. The forest persists as a revolutionary site of political struggle for ecological sovereignty. Not only is the forest a crucial space in which to reimagine the legal instruments of environmental governance and protection, it also offers new opportunities to renew our relationship to the land. In 2008, Ecuador held a referendum to rewrite the nation's constitution. In this rights of nature clause, the approved constitution marked the first time a nation formally acknowledged the legal standing of nature. They write, nature, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. All persons, communities, peoples, and nations can call upon public authorities to enforce the rights of nature. This clause was the outcome of a decades-long activist struggle against extraction and pollution in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Spearheaded by peasant and indigenous groups, the movement continues to fight against the territorial encroachment and catastrophic contamination of forest ecosystems and indigenous land in Amazonia. Critically, the foundational notion of the rights of nature clause is the indigenous concept of sumak kase, translated in English as good living. According to Alberto Acosta, former president of Ecuador's Constitutional Assembly, sumak kase works in direct opposition to capitalist forms of property, extraction, and development. From the struggles of the Maori people to attain recognition of personhood for the Wangui River in New Zealand, pictured here, to the Lake Erie Bill of Rights in Toledo, Ohio, Ecuador's Rights of Nature Clause offers a critical legal infrastructure for rebuilding systems of planetary care. By rendering the legal standing of nature defensible, the Constitution not only troubles the assumption of nature as a resource to be appropriated, but also recognizes that human rights are fundamentally tied to environmental health. Such forms of forest governance not only protect the sovereignty of nature, but also make legible the forms of kinship, entanglement, and conviviality that exist between a forest and its caretakers. Beyond providing critical legal protections for ecosystems and people, the Rights of Nature Clause has inspired political and technological expressions for more than human sovereignty. For instance, shown here, the art Project Terra Zero proposes a protocol that enables a forest to own itself, utilizing smart contracts and digital forestry tools to automate processes of forest maintenance and monitor tree health. Allies of the forest are increasingly harnessing digital tools, softwares, and sensors to manage landscapes and react in real time to destructive extraction, illegal logging, land treaty violations, and pollution. Drone LiDAR scanning can be used to produce high-res data sets of forests, measuring biodiversity and carbon sequestration. And these sensor technologies have greatly expanded the ability to sense ecosystems, initiating a forest awareness that is animating fieldwork with a new environmental imaginary. So against a sort of techno-positivist approach, these projects of environmental sensing are becoming an increasingly important tool for fighting extraction and raising awareness of anthropogenic climate change. Sensor networks, citizen science sensor networks, data share platforms, and DIY sensor toolkits are increasingly empowering citizens to reorient the environmental sensor away from extraction towards positive climate education and counteraction. For example, Jennifer Gabrus' ongoing Smart Forest project, shown here, deploys sensors in experimental forests to demystify these technologies for an expanded public. Furthermore, alongside spaces of climate protests exists a parallel practice of ecological forensics, benchmarking, measuring, and reporting. In the ongoing struggle against Chevron Texaco in Ecuador and the pollution of the Amazon, prosecutors are continuously gathering environmental data as proof of the ecological catastrophe. As Ursula Byman and Paulo Tavares recount in their project Forest Law, quote, "The forest was converted into a juridical court and a vast technical laboratory." These projects frame the living forest not only as an ecosystem, but also as a laboratory full of sensors collecting data to protect and enforce ecological sovereignty. So it is from these emerging forms of forest governance and ecological sovereignty that the field station, an architecture of environmental sensing, monitoring, and observation, we thought offered a participatory set of tools for forest defenders today. So while histories of scientific research stations are deeply entangled in imperial and settler colonial infrastructures, mobilizing environmental knowledge for extraction and dispossession, as we've heard in the previous panels, many field stations were in fact founded for educational and conservational purposes. So we're interested in art and architecture projects that begin to transform these institutions, reclaiming the field station as spaces of renewed environmental consciousness, such as in these two examples shown here, Mark Dion's South Florida Wildlife Rescue Unit and Chris Taylor's Great Salt Lake Exploration Platform, which are both pedagogical and art projects. So deeply entangled with the terrains that they study, these networks of field stations, citizen scientists, and environmental sensors construct, Latour writes, quote, "a view of the earth that is dynamic, complex, heterogeneous, and reactive. Rather than simplifying and abstracting, field stations measure and react to the complex exchanges between landscapes, peoples, geologies, fauna, and flora, creating a rich network of humans and non-human ecologies." So in response to these projects of environmental sensing, we've proposed an architectural prototype that explores the spatial practices of climate action and forest care. So Field Station is a public art piece that's currently on view in Washington University in St. Louis. The project consists of 6 panels mounted in aluminum trusses representing a field station and the possible forms of life that can unfold within. So as a hypothesis, the project asks, how can practices of digital forestry be reoriented away from extraction toward a more convivial and reciprocal relationship to land? So the site for this field station prototype, although it's built in St. Louis, is actually the Sam Houston National Forest, 50 miles northwest of Houston. The forest is a non-contiguous landscape overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and National Forest Service. It's a rich assemblage of ecologies that make up the East Texas piney woods region, including stands of loblolly pines, bottomland hardwoods, river swamps, and coastal prairies. But beneath the surface are outcrops of uranium-bearing strata, Eocene and Paleocene oil and gas fields, as well as quartz-rich industrial sands. So while the landscape appears ostensibly wild, the forest is in fact a highly managed territory, a patchwork of private property and public lands, hosting recreation, farming, mining, oil drilling, and timber harvesting. So from archaeological digs and ecological preserves to test landscapes and extraction sites, the forest is a messy terrain crisscrossed by hiking trails, utility easements, animal habitats, and oil pipelines. It's a contested space with multiple actors, multiple governors, competing desires for extraction and conservation. So within this context of the Sam Houston Forest, we ask, what would a future landscape of citizen scientist field stations, activist climate camps, autonomous woodlands, and forest cooperatives look like? This project imagines new ways that architecture can respond to the messy landscapes and disturbed ecologies of the Anthropocene. Xana Singh writes, quote, "To describe a patchy Anthropocene that is politically made, ecologically remade, and uncannily unreal, we need both observations and thought experiments." So responding to Singh's call, we propose an architectural experiment. Situated in this future landscape, the field station serves as an operational base for scientists performing fieldwork, supporting a network of mobile monitoring stations, providing power and satellite connections for remote access, and securing equipment for future experiments. Beyond the technical requirements of such research, the field station also serves as an outpost for meetings of local volunteer networks undertaking forest maintenance and gathering first-person observations from community members assessing habitat health. To assure the rights of nature upheld, these landscapes require constant observation and care, not only by scientists, but also by forest defenders and climate activists. Equipped with air, water, and soil sensors, field stations can measure ecological disturbance and pollutant emissions, monitor habitat distress, provide ground support for agitation against federal concessions for oil and minerals. Solar panel arrays provide energy sources for recharging stations and remote Wi-Fi transmitters, and water catchments and filtration create a freely available water supply for any through hikers. Somewhere between a tent and a building, the field station creates a narrative-rich environment, an adjustable infrastructure embedded in the forest industry. The field station is full of research documents, a map of a mine to be blockaded, laundry hung to dry, discussion circle, a seedling experiment, and a hovering drone. Packable, floatable, and deployable, the field station utilizes the tectonics of straps and flaps and cords that offer an endless capacity for on-the-fly data gathering, sensor troubleshooting, and quick software patches. Serving as a low-tech laboratory and mobile classroom, it can adapt to a wide variety of environmental conditions. The field station deploys easy-to-assemble building materials requiring minimum site prep that's adaptable to multiple terrains and have a low environmental impact. The envelopes composed of operable mesh panels and adjustable roof pieces with structural columns offering mounting locations for equipment. Rather than excavating the site, the field station requires an approach that is necessarily light, contingent, and adaptable, as easy to construct as it is to eventually dismantle. So these experimental narratives and encounters imagine possible forms of life that would accompany the maintenance and protection of forest sovereignty. Sleeping bags, storage lockers, the remains of forgotten meal, a trove of dog-eared field guides point to the types of residencies that could occur within. A rock bristling with a sensor grid, a pelican case for delicate instruments, a disassembled sensor tripod, and a half-finished Arduino board suggest what types of studying, monitoring, and troubleshooting may unfold. Immersed in a lush understory of ferns and fungi, these tableaus imagine joyous new protocols for stewardship and care within the Sam Houston National Forest, looking at the forest not as an ecosystem only, but also as a living laboratory. And just as a conclusion, alongside the installation in St. Louis, we also gathered the documents, maps, and information from our research into an open access field guide to the forest. To represent the Sam Houston National Forest, they required a messy assemblage, an open document that reflects the contested and contingent practices that define the territory, as well as a field station's possible interfaces with these competing interests. So this document, it hopes to avoid simplifications and easy reductions, putting forward an alternative relationship between embodied research, climate action, and a landscape. So as an architecture with an intimate relationship to the land, this field station and company guide suggests how we might reorient our environmental encounters away from extraction towards practices of reciprocity, abundance, and care. Thank you.
So thank you all so much. We're going to turn the lights up here. That was really fantastic. And for the speakers, I'm actually going to ask that I'm going to unmute you, but then if you could just stay unmuted if you don't mind, so that I don't have to in the participants window, because it is slightly cumbersome. We're going to open the floor in a little bit, but I thought since I'm here, I might actually start with a question, because one of the things that I was really invigorated by seeing these presentations was that there was a lot of pedagogy, and I think particularly, there's really, if I could say, a sort of new sensibility toward the sort of learning from studio, the kind of classic model of travel studio. I'm seeing people understanding landscapes of capital like differently than Ventura and Scott Brown did in Las Vegas. I'm seeing Emmanuel, I'm seeing you looking at Atlanta very differently than like Rem did, right? And so I found myself thinking, you know, to go back to something that Emmanuel said about working kind of against the ethnographic gaze. I was wondering if we could hear some reflections on what it means to do research now as architects on sites, particularly taking students, what it means to engage with these kind of sites in a sort of non-extractive ethos. I mean, we know what sort of generations of urban scholarship and kind of design research has been in terms of visiting sites to try to sort of unearth something of their character that becomes operational elsewhere. And so I'd be really interested to hear if you have some reflections on this, because I know that many of our students are asking these questions and trying to be very sensitive around the sort of some of these pitfalls of the relationship of academic research to the kind of deep engagement of community organizing. So any thoughts on that might be well.
I'll just say a couple of things just to get us started. Yeah, so the Atlanta After Property studio that I'm teaching right now, we're traveling to Atlanta in a couple of weeks, and we're dealing with these questions like right now, you know, and I think one of the things we've been saying to the students is when you engage with a site, just try to identify folks who are organizing around that site. These are already sites of contestation. So at least beginning conversations with those folks and resisting the urge of treating those folks as clients. Because whenever there's a certain level of engagement, then students want to kind of accept those representatives, which are often people who are able to speak about the place, but not necessarily speak for everyone. And how do you engage with them in conversation, but not necessarily treat them as clients? And I think that requires a lot of unlearning. And I think it's an ongoing experiment. And for us, it's really been about not necessarily documenting these sites and projecting them back out, but using our engagement with the sites to challenge our own assumptions about what architecture and urban design can do. And yeah, so I'd say that's kind of where we're starting.
I can jump in. I think it's a great question to start with. In Canada right now, well, actually, it's not just in Canada. In fact, I've been on a numerous studios as a reviewer in the States as well on Indigenous issues. And one of the things that, well, there's a couple of things. I really discourage the idea of like architects playing anthropologists in a sense, and it's tricky because I think anytime you position yourself as if you're studying someone else, I think you're kind of already off on a wrong tangent, in a sense. I think very similar to what Manuel just said. I like to think of design as building relations with people. It's not actually about studying them or working for them. That actually the design process itself has a tremendous power that goes under recognized, which is that you can build relationships with people. In Canada, we have a great conversation, not a great conversation, but an important conversation about reconciliation with our Indigenous people going on in this country. And one of the paths on reconciliation is to build relations with people and build trust. And design has a very unique capacity to do that. So that's one aspect. And then I would just say, like, also in terms of pedagogy and teaching, I just finished writing an essay that's out there online called The Design Lodge. And I've really been taking a look at the idea of studio, actually, and the origins of that word and questioning why we still use it, actually, because it's so I'm looking at the idea of a design lodge. And when I teach studios from an Indigenous perspective, I don't start off with a syllabus or talking about expectations and what the grading matrix are. We actually usually try to have food together outside somewhere, introduce each other. So it's also like how you create the infrastructure of your learning environment throughout the year in a respectful way. And I'm thinking about like when you're in a lodge, a traditional space, there's an element of the sacred in that. And for me anyways, I think that we've kind of neutralized our learning spaces so much that we've lost that affinity, that close relationship with the land and each other. And so trying to create a space that starts from that perspective, and fold in the other stuff about teaching later on, that'll come, but to set the premise up, set the table at the right level.
I guess, maybe I think two things. One, and I think it's a great question, a difficult one. I suppose, thinking about what David and others described as, the really truly psychotic twists that it takes to like come up with the idea of property and then to come up with the idea of, and to talk about it as a natural law, and it's absolutely insane. And to then enslave people to work on it as if they were also possessions. There's it seems like some of what the work to be done is just removing some of those toxic layers that obstruct the productivity that's there, or that constrain the real authors of community. And then the other thing I think about is how just about this word design is I also think of design in that same way. So there's a kind of like as if it was a kind of a crime, that was kind of an imposition or something. And yet someone like Arturo Escobar embraces that word design, but it's another kind of view of design as nudging things into entanglements, creating more and more relationships. And not dropping a thread, finding potentials between things. But that's a very different organ of design than the ones that we usually rehearse.
Yeah, and maybe just to pick up on that, I really appreciate, David, how you talked about the idea of like studio. It really sort of, it neutralizes, it sanitizes the kind of space of learning. And that's one of the reasons we're sort of intrigued by the idea of the field station, because it's something that's so embedded. It's a kind of a bristling, kind of instrument filled space. It's in a kind of a landscape, and the landscape doesn't have to be exceptional like Antarctica or a deep sea ocean, but the field station can be in this kind of like patchy space like San Houston Forest. It could be in an urban site, it could be a neighborhood. And there's something about the moment that you leave the institution and enter a kind of a much more sort of contingent and open space, all of a sudden it makes it really kind of enlivens that landscape and makes pedagogy not this sort of helicoptering kind of project, but something that is sort of completely embodied. And so I think that that's sort of another way. It's not another way of kind of looking at pedagogy. It has to kind of, and something we've lost over 2 years of COVID is like, it's been so hard to go to the site or to go meet people or to kind of to experience a different landscape or an environment. And so I think that that's what's sort of been so interesting about uncovering and unpacking the sort of histories and sort of experiments with the field station, because it offers that kind of a kind of a completely non-neutral kind of site of learning.
Great. Thank you. Janet, do you want to go?
I wanted to ask you a question about spatial strategies or design strategies. And as you were talking today, I was kind of jotting down what I heard as spatial strategies. And I heard questions about boundary, whether that's like patches or edges or lines being erased. I'm also hearing comments about representation, perhaps about kind of unlearning orthographic drawings from David. I'm hearing about material, about the sound as a kind of at the cross. I'm also hearing about, I guess, infrastructures or like tools that enact reciprocal relationships And it seems to me that in all of the ones I'm mentioning and all the ones I haven't thought of yet or haven't named yet, that there's a certain process of unlearning and relearning within those. So just curious to hear your thoughts on which spatial strategies you do align yourself with or that you have found productive, and what it has taken for you to kind of unlearn and relearn some of the associations with those strategies. I'm also very aware that it's 10:15 your time. So thank you for hearing that.
I'll jump in and just quickly say that I think that it's extremely difficult to unlearn in the context, and because I'm also a practitioner, the whole infrastructure of architectural practice is so constrained in many ways. Like your material options, I mean, you can speculate on we do a lot of affordable housing, and I would love to do so many different things, and when it comes down to what we're given, you're so constrained in what you can achieve. So there's that aspect of it. I think for me, the cores though are to change your starting point, and that is listening as a first place. So like really listening to community, and not just listening, but getting community engaged. And we just finished some sunshades where the community member drew the design onto them, and so like literally giving up your pen and your design authority in a sense, like I think there's something about that, like freeing yourself from that and welcoming other people into your design process as much as they are willing to in most cases. That kind of idea of collaborative and breaking yourself from the idea of whatever parameters people are setting for what good design is. It's a very difficult path, but I think that's important. And then I would just also say that I think for me and Douglas Cardinal, I'm deeply influenced by Douglas, but thinking about ceremony and spending time with elders and really challenging yourself to actually meditate on this stuff and ground yourself, because we live in our heads so much that that's actually another trap that you have to break from. If you really want to challenge it, you need to get out of, Douglas says, you got to get out of your head and into your heart. If you don't do that, you're trapped into intellectualizing everything. That your spirit has to come out of you somehow, and you'll find all those answers. A lot of the elders will tell you that. So, but yeah, when you've been trained in a Western, I've got a doctorate from a Western university, and those are hard things to break from.
Maybe just to add something, we've been rereading Ivan Illich's Tools for Conviviality, which I've been finding super kind of useful as a way to think. You ask for spatial strategies, but like another kind of like word we use in syllabi or design tools, right? And so I think it's kind of interesting when you think about the kind of relationship between your sort of design tactics, your representational techniques, your spatial strategies, and think about them as tools. And it's important to ask yourself, is your project, is the design, is it one that produces a space of domination, or is it one that produces a space of reciprocity or conviviality, right? Is it a tool that kind of takes power from others? Is it a tool that can be laid aside? Is it a tool that kind of metabolizes more than your own energy, right? And I think that he sort of proposes all these different ways of kind of assessing the relationship between a tool and power. And I think that's it. I think that's a kind of a really interesting way to kind of reflect on your own sort of spatial strategies, representational techniques, relationships to boundaries and drawings, and as these kind of architectural tools that we have at our disposal, but that have these sort of embedded power relationships. So it's sort of something that I don't have an answer, but it's been kind of a useful text for us as we sort of assess our own work.
Yeah, I guess it's also that thinking about what that organ of design is, that does not have an outcome. It's not in the way that we usually have expectations about it, which makes it difficult in maybe an architecture school, but also really difficult in a university. That's looking for the quantified proof, and even in popular culture, to tell a story right now without a quantified proof is, it's not easy to do that, or to say that what you're making is that you're really not making anything. You are only, catalyzing a kind of possible chain reaction that could go in a lot of different ways, and that you assume that the time frame for your engagement on this may be decades. I don't know whether our students have a comfort level with that. I wish it were possible that there would be not only a comfort level, but a joy with that I don't think is there. It's just not how, it's just not how we've been conditioned to think about what constitutes an accomplishment.
Yeah, you're snapping in the.
Yeah, I'll just add a minor note. I mean, there's the Audre Lorde quote that everyone brings up about the master's tools, and I don't know. I mean, also because I've just been thinking with Ruth Wilson Gilmore a lot lately, and she introduces her own intervention into that quote, saying the apostrophe between the R and the S that makes it something that is owned by the master is actually the problem, because the tool can do anything you want it to do, as long as there's a clear political agenda. And I think, at least in our practice, a lot of our political ambitions have been somewhat limited to the realm of image making. And that has, for the most part, been our commitment. I think the building becomes a really, really difficult thing to engage with, but in the realm of image making, we can be very explicit about our politics and our discomfort with transparency, our discomfort with measurability. And I think just even beginning there will force us to imagine a different type of world. And even the students right now, a lot of it has been about challenging them to see the world differently, which means they have to image the world differently. And yeah, I mean, I think that just requires us to keep revisiting those tools, but giving them new meaning and maybe new agency.
Great, thank you. Speaking of tools for conviviality and design, the empty seat next to me has organically become the question seat. So I'm going to shift my screen over and let gallery speak.
Hi, I'm Gauri, a graduate student here at CCA. My question is to Kellan, actually. She spoke about how we can imbibe stories to a physical space. I was just a little curious.
Maybe we should just double check. Can you hear? It seems like maybe not.
It's a little it's hard to,
Let's try one more time.
Hi, so my name is Gauri. I'm a graduate student here at CCA. My question is to Kellan. She earlier mentioned that how can we imbibe a story to a physical space? And I was just curious to know how exactly, and it's just a very fascinating.
well, I'm struggling with this, so I'm posing the question as a problem that I'm working on, because I guess I don't really know. I'm wondering about, I mean, we have stories about how to acquire things, but I don't see stories told where space is an actor, and where things are embedded in space, or where something like a spatial biography, where you see the kind of know-how that people have, the practical know-how that people have, like what James C. Scott calls metis, that way of operating in space. I don't see that animated in culture, creating a kind of cultural understanding about that. And so I wanted to try to do that. Will I just end up sounding like the same old academic with the same old strained voice, or I want to really try to get to make a popular story, that could have a broader audience, but understand the things you understand when you see dispositions of things in space. I think it's going to be a struggle, so I don't have,
Can I just jump in and I'll just share something. I don't know if this is totally related or not, but as you were speaking, Keller, when I first went up to Laurentian University, the first thing I did with our first year students, the very first class they had was actually sitting down with an elder from the area. And this is a small city in northern Ontario, but the first thing she told us was a story of Star Woman arriving, and their stories tell them that she hit the earth there, and there's a big crater there, which is part of Sudbury's history. It's a big mining town, and she told this beautiful story of that place that changed my idea of where I was in the world. And then she told another story about the two lakes on either side of the city, and in their teachings there's a serpent that goes down underneath between those two cities all the time, or between those two lakes, and it happens to go right underneath the city. And the psychogeography of the entire region changed through that hour and a half of her telling the stories of their people. So those stories, those geographical stories are here. They've been here for thousands of years. And when you hear the Indigenous people talk about them, there's so much knowledge in those stories. You understand why the sap comes from the tree at what time of the year. You understand what's happening with the landscape. You understand why the animals migrate to those parts of the sea, what kind of fish are. It's all embedded in these amazing stories of, I don't like the word mythologies, but they are stories of knowledge about place, and they're so rich. And so I always find it so amazing, having not grown up close to those traditional teachings, that every one of our communities on what we call Turtle Island as Indigenous people have those stories. They're there, and yet we've just ignored them and tried to rewrite. There's all this idea of rewriting stories over top of things that are already there. So I don't know. I am always inspired by that, and thinking about wherever students go, wherever they land, is seek out those stories as a starting point, because there's so much knowledge there. Yeah.
Now I have an organically formed question line, so I'm going to pass the computer this way, Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben. Can you hear me okay? I'm gonna just try and talk really loud. Is that all right? So I hope this isn't redundant, because I think some of you have already touched on this, but just sort of the general question is, how do you reconcile how am I reconciling like being an architect in sort of a capitalist society and like sort of being trained as a producer? Like what in this new model, like what becomes the product, I guess?
Well,
I'll offer a short version. I just say community. That's the end game. Forget about the physicalness of what is produced. Yes, we hope it's nice and it's aesthetic and functions. But I think, for me, anyways, that the core is you've built relationships, and the product is a better related understanding of who you are and the people you're with and the land and the land that you're on. That's a pretty good outcome to me. But maybe I'm simplifying it.
I'll also say maybe that the work that maybe speak for myself. The work that I'm suggesting for my students is not a part of like a client-based profession at all. It is work that's accomplished through other kinds of coalitions and partnerships, and in some ways, like, it allows you to kind of roll up your sleeves and get working when capital fails. Like that's when there's stuff to work with, the stuff that's kind of fallen off that ledger.
Thank you. Love it.
I agree.
To be mindful for time, I think, again, because of their East Coastness, I think we're going to take one more question. Arturo's going to step to the question table, and then we'll wrap things up.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Good.
You can.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much for being here more than anything. It's really inspiring, to be honest. But I think one of the questions that it kind of like came up as kind of like summarizing this whole event today is kind of like, where do we draw the boundary, and like how do we stop and listen to each other, right? To sort of like create this unifying solution that it's equivalently like a response to the capitalism issues, reclaiming advocacy, and like, for example, when does the environmentalist work becomes a sense of research and translation for land and indigenous rights, you know? So I think like, I don't know, I'm just trying to like merge it all together as a form of like, how do we conclude this, right? Like all these efforts are being done sort of individually, right? And it's great, but I think the bigger question is like, how do we unite to propose a solution that kind of like pushes boundaries and really unbalances the system, right? Especially because we have forgotten our like human nature and like the way that like we have forgotten our cores of a species, you know, that we use space and use land for like our own resources, but in a limited form, and we have forgotten that by capitalism. And I don't know, it's like, how do we take up space and how do we unite to sort of like propose a solution? Thank you so much.
Maybe I'll jump in. I think that's a really fantastic question. And maybe we can tease out the difference between, I think it's important to kind of form these coalitions, to form collectives, to find ways of building solidarity together, but that doesn't maybe necessarily mean that there's a single unified solution, right? I think that a lot of this work is about kind of understanding that everything is kind of contingent. It's situated. It's based on a kind of set of local conditions, both present and past. And that's one of the reasons why I would point you to read the work of Anna Singh, which I found really useful and inspiring, because she has this kind of amazing way of talking about the kind of patchiness, the messiness, and the disturbances of the worlds that we live in. There aren't like kind of pure ideas of nature to fix, right? Or pure ideas of capitalism either, right? But it's really about understanding that all of these sort of systems are completely entangled. And so there's no such thing as a one-off solution, but there's definitely such a thing as coalition building. And there's definitely such a thing as solidarity. So I think it's about figuring out ways to work together without having kind of a single sort of top-down way of solving it.
I'll offer a few thoughts on that. I completely agree with that comment, that there's no one solution. I often, like, you know, I'm teaching a course called Architectures of Reconciliation right now, and in very difficult conversations, I always recommend that you have to start from the common ground. Well, you know, what do you share? What are those common values? Because I believe we, as you just said, as human beings, we do have some common values. And I'll just on that note, I heard a Métis woman in a conference this week say something I hadn't heard before. She you know, gave her thanks to everybody, and then she thanked the water in the river, because she just had a teacher tell her that she thanked everybody on the panel and stuff, and then she thanked the Ottawa River, because she said she was just taught something that seems so obvious, but like the water that comes out of the tap actually comes from the Ottawa River. And, you know, we are 70% water. So she said, you know, I just wanted to thank, because the Ottawa River is inside me right now, right? And like, that's, if you think about that, wherever you are right now, we all are filled up with the waters that are around, and getting back in touch with, really reflecting on that. And I think for me, it's changing our habits on how we think about things is crucial to all of this, because we have been trained to think about things in non-reciprocal ways. And I mean, many people tonight here mentioned that word of reciprocity. And it's core to many indigenous teachings, that idea of giving back. You know, I mean, you may already know this, right? The idea of putting tobacco down before you take something. That's a habitual thing that indigenous people do. You don't take a piece of wood from the land without putting tobacco down and saying a prayer for it. That's habit. But how do we, you know, collectively come to a place where everybody's doing that? It's a huge challenge. That's why I think I like what was just said by Brittany, that, you know, all of these little desperate things that are happening, they might not seem in and of themselves, you know, revolutionary, but when you think about them collectively, what's happening, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty powerful what's happening around the world right now.
Just kind of expanding on what Brittany is saying too, is I completely agree. And even today with students, we were reading that bit of one of those moments where Anna Singh is talking about patchiness, and he says inconsistency may be our greatest asset. You know, and I think even that's a very savvy remark, even when thinking about some of the most difficult kind of political superbugs that we, that seem to make all reasonable politics impossible. You know, that inconsistency is a very strong way to counter that.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just adding to what was said. I mean, to me, there's always a reflex to look for something universal, though. And I think we need to find a way to resist that reflex. And, I think we need to start finding different ways of imagining difference and even boundaries. Because I think when we start forming solidarity with subjectivities that are radically different from ours is when we're moving in the right direction. And, I mean, I've had conversations about this issue with people like, I mean, today for our studio, there was a presentation by Ziad Jamaluddin, and he lectured on the Waqf, which is kind of this Islamic land tenure system that removes land from the marketplace, basically. But the ways in which it's delivered, it's radically different from the way I understand my spirituality or my relationship to land. And I know there are nuggets there that would inform the way I would operate in certain contexts. So I think somehow we need to fight to maintain difference, but also imagine radically different forms of solidarity. And yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, on behalf of Jeanette and Keith and everybody else in this room, thank you all so much. I mean, it's been such a invigorating, thrilling, moving conversation. It's given us so much to think about and think with. So one last round of applause for these. We hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.